welcome back to 100 Days of Code. This is Angela from the App Brewery, and today is day 15, where we're going to set up our local development environment for Python, and we're going to be building a coffee machine project. So when we designed the course, we really wanted you to get up and running as fast as possible and start coding straight away. But as our project gets more and more complex, then it's really important to start thinking about setting up a proper development environment. Now, if you are a chef, then you need really sharp knives. And as a programmer, you need a good development environment. In today's lesson, I'm going to show you how to set up my favorite IDE. And the IDE stands for an Intelligent Development Environment. This is a piece of software that will help you as you're creating your code, and it's going to do a whole bunch of things for you, including things like linting your code, finding errors in it, giving you guidance on your coding style, helping you debug issues, just making life easier for you as you start writing more and more code. This is the moment where you're graduating from a newbie developer. It's like as if you've gone into the mountains, you've fetched water for this old sensei for like 20 years, and finally he is going to show you how to use a sword. This is going to be the equivalent of our sword. Now, in terms of development environment, there's actually a whole bunch to choose from. And you might have heard of some of these, like Jupyter or Spyder, VS Code, and some of them we've already used, like Thonny. But the one that we're going to use is something called PyCharm. And this is an intelligent development environment, an IDE that is specialized for Python. The tool has been sharpened especially for Python coding, and it's what the professionals use. In the coming lessons, we're going to get really familiar with this tool, and gradually I want to show you how it can help you become a better and more productive developer. But before we can get started installing PyCharm, we first have to get the latest version of Python installed on your computer. In the course resources, you can go ahead and find the download link for Python. Then once you're there, it should automatically detect your current operating system. So here I'm on Windows, and it says download the latest version for Windows. And then if you click on the big download button, it'll ensure that you get the latest version of Python. Now, it's actually a very small file, so it shouldn't take very long to download. And once it's complete, go ahead and open up that exe file. Now, go ahead and make sure that the checkbox for Add Python 3.8 to Path is checked, and then leave everything else as it is and click on Install Now. And make sure that you have admin privileges while you're installing. So you have to be logged on as the administrator and say yes to any of the prompts. Now, installation should only take a few minutes. And once it's done, you might get a hint here saying disable path length limit. If you see that, then go ahead and click on it. And again, say yes for allow. And then you're done and you can close off the wizard. If you're on a Mac, the process is virtually identical. Once you head over to the link from the course resources, you should see it automatically let you download the latest version for Mac. And once download is complete, you can go through the wizard, clicking continue, agreeing to everything that they ask you to agree, and click install. And again, you'll need to be on the administrator account and type in your password to allow Python to be installed on your computer. Once installation is completed, it should open up this folder and you should see Python 3.8 or a later version like 3.9 or 3.10. But as long as you see this, then you've been successful and you can delete the installer from your computer. So now you should have successfully installed Python onto your computer, and we're ready to proceed to the next step. Head over to the next lesson and we're going to download and install PyCharm. So you should have now successfully installed Python onto your computer, and we're ready to proceed to the next step, which is to download PyCharm. Again, in the course resources, you'll find a link to the homepage to download PyCharm. And once you get to this page, you should click on the download button and this takes you to the options page. Now here it should automatically select your system. So currently I'm on a Windows computer and it's automatically selected the Windows tab. And you can click on the system requirements to make sure that your computer is compatible. And you can also take a look at the installation instructions, which is pretty simple. It's basically download and run. So there's two versions of PyCharm, the professional and the community version. You're going to select the community version because it's completely free and open source to use. The professional version has a free trial, and after that you'll have to pay for it. But the community version already has all of the features that we need and more. Once you click on download, that will take a little while, anywhere between 5 to 10 minutes. So while you're waiting for that to run, you can head over to the next lesson and I'll talk about some of the features of PyCharm that we can look forwards to. Now, if you're on a Mac, the process is pretty much the same. So head over to the link that's in the course resources, click on download, and download the community version of PyCharm. Now, if you're a Linux user, you can also toggle to the Linux tab. And while you're here, you can look at the system requirements and the installation instructions. Once you're ready, go ahead and click on the download button for the community edition, which is free and open source, and then download will begin. And again, it'll take anywhere between 5 to 10 minutes, so let it download and head over to the next lesson where I want to show you some of the great features of PyCharm. Up until now, we've been using Replit as our code editor. And Replit has a number of great features, like how easy it is to share code and to fork copies of the same code so that you can always get the starting code and the final code. But Replit does have its limitations. And as you're becoming more and more advanced, and you start building more complex projects, you'll start to feel the constraints of a simple text editor like Replit. Now, PyCharm is a tool that's used by professionals, and I want to show you a couple of features so that you can see firsthand why PyCharm is so popular with Python developers. And the first thing I really like about it is also a very, very basic thing. It's spell check for the English words that you use in your code. This just means that while you're writing code, you're creating names for your variables, creating your keys, your values, or your print statements, that it makes sure that the English that you write, the parts that's not actually code, is actually spell checked. And you won't believe how many times this will save your skin. Here's an example. Something that's really, really sensitive to spelling is a dictionary. We all know that when we're using a dictionary, and let's say we wanted to print one of the values from our dictionary, we're taking our contacts and getting hold of James's details, and then we're trying to get hold of his phone number. Now, if you type this wrong, for example, if I wrote phone number without an E and I try to run this, then you'll see I get an error. But the spell check should already alert you to the issue before you even hit run. See how this is underlined with a squiggle, and it tells you that there's a typo in the word phone, and you can click change to phone maybe. And it's just a subtle hint to say, hey, I think maybe you got that wrong. Just double check. And indeed, once we fix that, then we get rid of all our issues and everything works perfectly. The next feature that I really like is having more space to develop. What do I mean by this? Well, very often we actually tend to have more than one code file, right? For example, let's say that we moved our contacts into this data file and we imported it instead. So we'll say from data import contacts. And now when I want to code things up and I want to get hold of certain things, for example, I want to get Jenny's email, then ideally I would want to see this side by side, right? In PyCharm, all you have to do to split the screen is just right click on the file and then say split and move right. And now all of a sudden you can see both sides at once. This means it's so much easier to refer to some other piece of code when you're developing. So here I can now easily see that the key for Jenny has a capital J. So I have to tap into my contacts, tap into the key Jenny, and then get hold of her email. This split screen comes in really handy as your code gets more complex and there's more and more files. And now another advanced feature of an IDE compared to a simple text editor like Replit is a built-in linter. So what is a linter? Well, a linter in real life is something that picks off little bits of dust, bits of lint from your clothing. And in programming, it's something that picks out bits of code that you've written that might not be in accordance to the style guide. When we're writing code and we're trying to decide, well, how many spaces do I leave between things? Do I use tabs or spaces? What is the maximum line length? All of these sort of things that maybe won't break your program per se, but it will mean that your program might look different from somebody else's, and you just want to know what is the convention so that you can keep your code consistent with other Python developers. Well, this is what a style guide is for. And the style guide that most Python developers will abide by is something called PEP 8. And we've already seen this when we were talking about tabs versus spaces. For example, the guidance is that an indentation should have 4 spaces. And indeed, it should be spaces over tabs. And then there are other things like what's the maximum line length so that your lines of code don't become really, really long and difficult to read. Or things like how many blank lines should there between functions and variables in your code, and all sorts of things. This is a very long document, and it's actually very difficult to read all of it and remember all of it while you're in the middle of coding. But luckily for us, if we're using PyCharm, it automatically applies those rules and guidance to our code and lints our code. For example, if I was to create a function called myFunction, and inside here I've just got 2 inputs, n1 and n2, and then it calculates the total by adding n1 to n2, and it returns the total as an output. Now, at a later point, I decide to call my function, passing in some numbers, maybe say 4 and 5. Now, firstly, notice how I've got some light yellow squiggly lines under both of these lines. And when I hover over it, so I don't have to click on it, I just keep my cursor on top of the line which has the squiggles, you can see it tells me that PEP 8 guidance specifies that there should be 2 blank lines after a class or function definition, but instead it only found 1. So basically what it's trying to say is that the style guide says that there should be 2 lines after and before each of your functions so that everything is more spaced out and easier to read. And here, when I hover over it, you can see it says there's missing white space after the comma. So the style guide says that every time you use a comma in your code, you should always have a space. This way, again, it's easier to read and it keeps your code consistent with other Python developers so that when people look at your code, they can see that you're following the standard conventions. But remember that this does not affect how your code runs. Even with all of these suggestions and these style guide rule breaks, it doesn't actually mean my code won't work. If I run it, you can see that it works perfectly without any errors. And it's only a matter of keeping your code tidy and keeping it in line with the conventions that Python developers have set out. Now, another advanced feature of an IDE compared to a text editor is the ability to view your local history. What that means is I can go to Show History, and just as if you were in a browser, you can see your browsing history. Well, here you can see all of your coding history. So you can scroll back all the way in the last 12 hours and see the edits that you've made. For example, at 13 past 4 today, I created this brand new function. So this is the current file, and this is what it looked like at that moment in time. Now, Scrolling forwards into the future, the next thing I did was I added a new function call here, and I added some space here. So if you've had some sort of catastrophic event and you've realized that you've really messed up and you've deleted everything, you can always scroll back to previous time points and simply just copy and paste the code, or you can revert back to that particular time point. Can you imagine if you were writing your essay and the number of times I have lost my essay because my computer has crashed? Imagine if you had this ability to just scroll back in time and find one snapshot that you liked and then revert everything back to that moment in time. How powerful could that be? Well, you now have that in your hands with local history in PyCharm. Now, another really handy feature is the ability to view the structure of your code. Instead of going to the project navigation, if I click on this structure pane here, you can see that it breaks down my code into all of the variables and all of the functions. That means that my function could be declared, many hundreds of lines somewhere else, and I'm scrolling around and I'm trying to find it. All I have to do is look at, well, here's my function, and if I click on it, it takes me straight there, and I can now edit it if I wish. And if I needed the variable Jenny email, well, it takes me straight there as well. Once you start having lots and lots of variables and lots of functions, this is a lifesaver. Now, there's a lot of other features that I'm going to show you that PyCharm can do, but I want to do it gradually. For now, here's the last tip on PyCharm. Whenever you create a variable or a function name and you end up using it in lots of places, so for example, you might call my function here, and then you might call my function again, passing in some different parameters at some later point in time, and then you decide that actually, I really don't like the way that I've named that function. It would make so much more sense if it was called add instead, because it returns the total, right? If I was to do this manually in a code editor, I would have to go add, and then all of these lines will break, and I have to find all of them and then change them manually, and that's very painful. So instead, what you can do in PyCharm is you can right-click on the name of your function or your variable, go to Refactor, Rename, and now it will find all of the places where this function is created, where it's called, and you can now change it everywhere. So click Refactor, and it's now found the function that needs to be renamed and also all the places where it's used. So it's used in two places, here on line 11 and here on line 14. So now I click Do Refactor, and what will happen is it'll change all the places where it occurs. And it's much safer than, say, just using find and replace. Let's say that I had a print statement here that said, my function is a function. And if I used find and replace, where I just say, well, my function now equals add, and I click on replace all, it's going to now change it in all the places. But on the other hand, if I use refactor rename, then it's going to be intelligent enough to know that this print statement is just text, whereas the places where my function is used and the places where my function is declared, that is what I want to refactor and rename, and it leaves all of the innocent bystanders alone. There's a lot of really exciting things yet to come as we start getting used to using PyCharm. But as with any new tool, you'll spend a little bit of time getting up and running with it and getting used to using it. Now, when I was in primary school, I still remember the moment when I got to graduate from writing with pencils to writing with a Beryl handwriting pen. And it was a really significant moment in my life when I was allowed to write with the adult tools. So this is kind of what's happening right here. We're graduating to PyCharm. It's going to take a little bit of getting used to and learning our ropes, but it's going to take us closer to our goals. Hopefully by now, PyCharm should have now downloaded and you're ready to head over to the next lesson where we're going to install it. Now that you've downloaded PyCharm, we're ready to go ahead and install it onto your computer. Now, this video, I'm going to go through all the steps for installing and setting up PyCharm on Windows. If you're on a Mac system, then go ahead and skip this lesson and you'll find the walkthrough on the next lesson. Once your download is completed, go ahead and click on the exe file if you're running on Windows. And then you're just going to go ahead and follow the wizard. And if you want to have an icon on your desktop, check the checkbox to add the launcher, and then go ahead and click Next. Now leave everything as the default and click Install. Installation should only take a couple of minutes. And once it's done, you can go ahead and click Finish. Now you can double click on the icon to open up the program. And the first time you do so, you'll need to agree to the privacy policy and choose whether if you want to share data with them. Now you get to pick your UI style, either dark mode or light mode, and then you can skip all the rest of the setup. Now to test it out, go ahead and create a new project and name it whatever you want. But the really important thing is to click the Project Interpreter dropdown, and under Base Interpreter that you select the latest version of Python that you just installed, which in my case is Python 38, which stands for 3.8. It'll take a few moments before your project gets set up, and once it does, you might see a little pop-up that says something about Windows Defender. If you see this, then go ahead and click Fix and click Configure Automatically. If you don't see this pop up, then don't worry about it. Now you can go ahead and right click on your project folder and select New and then New File. Now we're going to create a new file, which is going to be called main.py. And in this file, we're going to test it out just by writing a hello world that will get printed to the console. And once you're done, then go ahead and click on Run, and then select the main.py file to run. And the console should now pop up and you should see Hello World printed. That's it. You're ready to start working with PyCharm, and you should be able to use it in the same way that you used Replit. In this video, I'm going to walk through the process to install PyCharm on Mac. Now, if you're on a Windows computer and you've already installed PyCharm, then you can skip this video. So you should have now downloaded the PyCharm installer. So go ahead and open up the DMG file. Now, when you see this window, drag the icon for PyCharm into the Applications folder. And now you can go to Spotlight and search for PyCharm. Then go ahead and click on it to open it up. Now make sure that you have admin privileges and go ahead and say Open. And then agree to their privacy policy and decide if you want to share data with them or not. Now you can select Never Used PyCharm and click Next. Then you can pick between Dark Theme or Light Theme and click Next. And then go ahead and click on Skip Remaining and Set Defaults. Now we can go ahead and create our first project in PyCharm. Name your project whatever you want, but it's really important that you click on this drop down to check that your project interpreter, and especially the base interpreter, is set to the latest version of Python that you installed, which in my case is Python 3.8. Now, if you're running on a Mac or a Linux, you might see several versions of Python in that drop-down list. So make sure that you select the latest version that you installed and then click Next. Once it has configured and created your new project, this is what you should see. And now you're going to go into your project folder, right-click on it, and then go to New File. Now on a Mac, right-click is also the same as control clicking. So you could hold down the control key and then click on the project folder. And again, choose New and then File. And the file we're going to create is going to be our main.py. Now inside here, all that we're going to do is just print Hello World. And we're going to run this code and make sure that it works. So go to Run and then click on this Run button and select the main Python file as the one you want to run. And then down here, you should see the Run tab pop up all of a sudden, and you should see your hello world printed in the console. And then it'll say process finished with exit code 0. 0 is success, and that means you're now all set up and you're ready to start using PyCharm as if it were any other Python editor. So anything that you've done in Replit, you can now do in PyCharm. You can create new files, you can write the files, and you can run those files. Now you should have PyCharm up and running, and we're finally ready to tackle today's project, which we're going to write in PyCharm. You've just been hired, congratulations. But first, there's the matter of coffee. We all know that programmers can't work unless they're loaded up on coffee. So your company has asked you to create the code for a coffee machine. Now, you very cleverly go online and look at the other coffee machines, and you notice that it only costs $230 to buy a coffee machine. But you're not going to cheat. You're going to create everything from scratch. And luckily, we don't actually have to build the hardware because we're programmers, right? But we're going to use this real-life coffee machine as the inspiration for our virtual coffee machine, noting the features and the capabilities. So what does it say? I found some wonderful graphics on here, which tells me that there are 3 hot flavors, which I'm guessing are these 3 buttons. It's coins operate, which I think they mean it's coin operated, and there's not much else that it can do. Let's take this example, and we're going to make a digital version of it. We're going to create our own coffee machine. And the first step we need to replicate is the ability to make 3 hot flavors. So the flavors we're going to make are 1 espresso, 2 latte, and 3 cappuccino. Here are the recipes for these 3 types of drinks. Each of them requires a different quantity of water, a different quantity of coffee, and a different quantity of milk. And they also each have a different price. We're going to be modeling all this data in our coffee machine program as well. But luckily for you, in the starting code, I've already included all of this data inside a dictionary, so you don't have to remember this. Although it might help if you're at home and you decided that you really wanted a latte instead of your usual black coffee. Now, in addition, the coffee machine has some resources that it has to manage. So it starts out with 300 mils of water in the tank, 200 mils of milk, and 100 grams of coffee. The second feature of our coffee machine is that it's coin operated. So we're going to be using American coins. And they have 4 types of coins: the penny, the nickel, the dime, and the quarter. They used to also have the dollar as a coin, but a few years ago they stopped minting that, so we're not going to count it, and it probably means one less if statement for us. Notice what each of these coins are worth. The penny is worth a cent, the nickel worth 5 cents, and the dime 10 cents, and the quarter is a quarter of a dollar. These represented in decimal values would look something like this. Now here's the important part. Let's think about what our program requirements are if we break it down. 1, we need our coffee machine to be able to print a report. It needs to be able to tell us what resources it has left, how much water it has left, how much milk, etc. If you head over to the completed version of the coffee machine, the link is in the course resources, and you can go ahead and try out the final version of the coffee machine. So let's say that we wanted a report on all the resources that the machine has. All we have to do is type report, and we can see all the resources we have. Now, in addition to being able to print a report, we also want to be able to check that the resources are sufficient when the user orders a drink. Now, let's say that the user decided to order a latte. It asks me to insert some coins, and then it gives me the change and it gives me the latte. But now, if I check the report, I can see that I've only got 100 mils of water left. And I know from the previous slide that a latte and a cappuccino is going to need more than that amount of water. So let's see what happens if I go ahead and order a cappuccino. It says, sorry, there's not enough water. So our program is able to look through all the resources that the machine has, checks it against the recipe of the drink that we're trying to make, and tells the user if there is insufficient water or if there's insufficient milk. And as long as one of the resources is insufficient, then it can't make the drink, and it gives the feedback to the user. Now, as you saw before, our program also needs to be able to process coins because our machine is coin operated. So no fancy contactless payments or pay with your Apple Watch, none of that. We've only got coins. When we order something, it should ask us to insert coins, and it's going to ask for the quantity of each type of coin. So let's say that I insert one of each. Then in this case, there's actually not enough money to cover my drink, and it refunds the money and doesn't give me a drink. But on the other hand, if I do insert enough money, then it should be able to calculate how much money all of these coins are worth, and then calculate the amount of change based on the cost of my drink. And then it should hand me my drink and tell me to enjoy. So in addition to being able to process the 4 types of coins, calculating the actual monetary value based on the number of coins, it should also check that the transaction is successful, that the user didn't try to hoodwink us by not giving enough coins and asking for a drink. So if they haven't inserted enough coins, then we're just going to refund them and tell them, sorry, that's not enough money, and not give them their drink. But if the transaction was successful, then we're going to make the coffee, and in the process of making the coffee, we're going to have to deduct the resources. Notice how every time we make a drink, say in this time we made a latte, and previous to the latte, we had 300 mils of milk, but after the latte, when we asked for the report, you can see that the water has been reduced, the milk has been reduced, the coffee has been reduced, and the money has been put into the coffers. This program, even though it seems simple, just a simple digital version of a coffee machine, it actually has quite a few requirements. So I recommend that you look at this screen and try to see how each of the requirements work by having a play around with the final version of the code. Now, I've created a detailed program specification for you as a PDF file, which you can download in the course resources. And this goes into a lot more details on each of those points. For example, what should the prompt print in the beginning of the program, and then how to turn the machine off, how to print the reports, and how each of those points should work in detail. Go ahead and download this and make sure you read each of the sections and test it out in the final working version of the project. Once you're ready, you can go ahead and head over to the starting version of the code. And again, I'm sharing this using Replit, but I want you to copy everything that's in here. There's only one file, the main.py file. And I want you to create a new project using PyCharm and call it Coffee Machine. And then create a new file inside your project called main.py. And then paste all of the starting code into your main.py. And now you're going to code inside this file. And once you're ready, you're going to click run, and you'll be able to run this main.py down here, and this will act as your console. Now, one really handy feature of PyCharm is something called to-do tracking. Whereas previously in Replit, I've been creating to-dos, and you've been able to view them. But if I had lots of to-dos in different places, you can't actually see all of them at once. You have to scroll through the file looking for them. But in a professional tool, we actually have something called to-do tracking, and it's a tab that's down here. So if I go ahead and take some of these program requirements, I can put them in as to-dos. To create a to-do, you have to follow the syntax. First is a £, and then we write to-do in all caps, and notice how that's just changed color just now. And now you can see in the to-do tab, it's found one to-do item. Now we can write to-do number 1, and this is to print a report of all the coffee machine resources. Now, let's say that I created a to-do somewhere else, right? Like all the way up here. Check that the resources are sufficient to make the drink order. And notice how they're completely in different places, in a different order, but every time I create one of these to-dos using this format, it will get picked up in the to-do tab. And you can go ahead and see where they live. So it's found 2 items inside our main.py, and you can see that this one is to-do 1, this one is to-do 2, and when you click on them, they'll take you to the correct places in your code. Use this to break down the problem into smaller problems that you can solve one by one, just as you've done before, and try to see if you can complete this project. Just a word of warning, this project is quite ambitious, but you've now got professional tools to help you, and you've got a lot more skill under your belt. So give this problem at least an hour to work on it, and make sure that you satisfy all the criteria that's set out in the program requirements, and also that your program works exactly the same as the final version of the coffee machine. Now, there are so many possible solutions to create this coffee machine program satisfying all the requirements. And the way that you code it up is essentially your choice, right? Whether if you decide to use a while loop or use a for loop or create a different data structure, there are endless possibilities. What I'm going to show you now is just one of those possibilities. And what's really important is you don't feel like you've done it wrong just because it's different to mine. As long as it works the way that you expect it to, then consider yourself successful. The first thing I'm going to do is create a new project in PyCharm, and I'm going to call my project Coffee Machine. Again, making sure that I've got the latest version of Python as the interpreter, I'll click Create. Now, the first thing I'm going to do here is right-click on this and create a new file, which is going to be my main.py. And then I'm going to go to my starting project in Replit, and I'm just going to copy everything there is over here and paste it into this main.py. Now, you might find the font of your code or of PyCharm a little bit too big or too small. If that's the case, you can just go into Preferences and change the appearance and the font to a different size, and this is for the user interface. And if you want to change the font of the editor, then you can go here, go to font, and then change that size here. I've tried to make it as large as possible so that when you're looking at this video on an iPad or an iPhone, all the code should still be readable. But of course, normally when you're coding, you'd probably want to fit more lines into the same screen. But it's not good to strain your eyes, so try to strike a balance there. Now I'm going to collapse that sidebar because I'm going to be coding entirely in this one file. Now notice at the beginning we get given a menu, and this is a dictionary which contains 3 entries, and each of those entries have a name of a drink, espresso, latte, and cappuccino, and then each of them have a value that holds a bunch of data, including the ingredients that are required to make that drink and also the price of the drink. Now, there's also a resources dictionary which holds the resources of the coffee machine. Now that we've got all of that, then we're ready to go. I'm going to tackle these requirements one by one. And the first one says to prompt the user by asking, what would you like, espresso, latte, or cappuccino? So I'm actually going to just straight up copy this line and put that into an input. This is going to be saved into some sort of variable, which I'll name choice. Now it tells me that the prompt should show every time action has completed. For example, once the drink is dispensed, and it should show again and again and again. So that means we're probably going to have to embed this input in some sort of while loop. So I'm just going to say for now, while something is true, then keep asking for this prompt. Right now, if we decide to go and run this code, where we go to run and then click on this button and then select the main.py to run, then you can see that it asks me, what would you like? And if I put an input, it'll keep asking me until eternity, basically, because there's currently no way of turning that true into false. So let's take a look at the next requirement. We should be able to turn off the coffee machine by entering off into the prompt. For maintainers of the coffee machine, they can use off as the secret word to turn off the machine, and your code should end execution when this happens. So when somebody wants to buy coffee, this is the line that they see. But when a maintenance guy comes along, then they should be able to enter something. And if this choice happens to equal the secret code, which is off, then in this case, we should stop the while loop and exit. So that gives us a way of changing this true into some other form of variable, right? So we could create a new variable called isOn, start it off as true, and while the machine is on, then it should continue to loop through and ask the user for their choice. But if the choice happens to be off, then we're going to turn that isOn into false. Now if we run our code again, so now that you've run it once, you can either stop it or you can rerun it. And now it's going to stop your existing code and rerun the code. So if you don't want to see this dialog every time, then just check this box and then click stop and rerun. So now if we make a selection or we say something, basically anything other than the keyword, which is off, it's going to loop back and forth and keep prompting us. But if I say off, then the machine turns off and you can see that I've now exited the program. Now we've tackled 1 and 2, let's go on to number 3. When the user enters the keyword report to the prompt, another secret word, a report should be generated that shows the current resource values, for example, water, milk, coffee, and money. So how can we do that? Well, firstly, we don't actually have a variable that holds the amount of money. So let's create something, let's call it profit maybe, and set it to equal 0 to begin with. Our machine has an empty money box in the beginning. So now we have to check to see, well, elif, the choice, was equal to report. Well, in this case, we have to generate a report. And the report is basically going to print all the values of these resources. So I'm simply going to copy the expected output and I'm going to paste it here. And then we can try and turn that into print statements, making it dynamic instead of hard-coded. In my case, I want to add print in front of all of these lines. And previously, we've been doing this just by writing it one by one, and then maybe we could copy and paste it. But let me show you a quick tip that you can do in PyCharm. If you're on Windows, hold down the Alt and the Shift key on your keyboard. If you're on a Mac, hold down the Option and the Shift key. Now, click at the beginning and hold and drag down. So if that doesn't work, try it a few times, you'll get the hang of it eventually. But notice how I've now got 4 cursors, and that means when I write print, check this out. Isn't that cool? I've managed to write on 4 lines at once because I need that repeat functionality. And this is a way of doing multi-line editing. Remember that shortcut and use it in the future if you find it useful. So I'm actually going to change this all into F strings because I want to change these numbers. Instead of being hard-coded, I want to insert them into here using the curly braces. The water is stored under resources, and then it's in the key called water. And now notice how I've got a outer double quote, so I can't have an inner double quote. So I'm going to change this into single quotes instead, like so. And I'm going to do the same for milk and coffee. So now I've added the water, milk, and coffee into my print statement. All I have left is the money. So let's delete the value and let's insert that profit into here. Now let's run our code again and let's check it out. If I type report, it should now give me a report of all the current values, and money is equal to $0 because that's what we start off with. We're now ready to tackle number 4. Here we have to check that when the user chooses a drink, we're going to check if there are enough resources to make that particular drink they chose. For example, if a latte requires 200 ml of water, but there's only 100 ml left in the machine, it should not make the drink because it actually can't make the drink, and it's going to print out, sorry, there's not enough water, or not enough milk, or not enough coffee, whatever it may be. So let's tackle this particular checkpoint. Now that I've got the if choices equal off, if choice equals report. Now, if it's not either of those, then they're probably going to be entering the name of a drink. So let's catch that using an else statement. And then inside this else statement, I'm going to get hold of the particular drink that they ordered by tapping into our menu dictionary and then using that choice they typed in as the key. Let's say that the particular drink that they chose is equal to menu, and then the key is of course going to be the choice. So now if I just print this drink and I run my code, so the shortcut for running is actually holding down the Control and R. And now I can go down here and you can see it's asking me for what I would like. So I'm going to choose latte, and what's going to be printed is the latte entry in my recipes dictionary up here. So this particular value. Now that I've got this value stored inside a variable called drink, well then I can tap into its ingredients and loop through each of the ingredients, comparing it against the resources and seeing if there's enough. Now, this is a little bit of functionality that should probably be self-contained. So instead of just printing the drink, I'm actually going to create a new function. So up here, I'm going to create a new function with our def, and I'm going to call it is resource sufficient. And this is resource sufficient is going to take the order ingredients as a input, and then it's going to work on that. So if we want to call that function and pass in the order ingredients, we'll have to call is resource sufficient, and then the order ingredients will be from the drink, and then getting hold of the values under the key ingredients. So under this particular key, it will fetch this particular dictionary, and this is the dictionary that's going to be passed over to this function as the input. So now that we have a hold of a dictionary with all the ingredients that are required and the amount of each ingredient, we can now compare it against our resources, which is a very similar dictionary with the resources and the amount that's left in the machine. We can loop through the order ingredients, and for each of the items in the ingredients, we're going to check to see if the order ingredients at that particular key, so this is getting hold of the value, is greater than or equal to the resources using the same particular key. For example, if we were looking at the first example, the item would be equal to water. So if we fetch the value from order ingredients with the key of water, we should get hold of 200, and we would now test to see if 200 is greater than or equal to the 300 that we have under the resources. Well, in this case, then we should probably tell the user that we actually can't make it. So let's put an if statement there. And I'm going to use this same string here to print it out. Now notice when I pasted that string in, and it has the double quotes from the PDF file here, that it's actually not being recognized, and I'm getting an error here. And the important thing to note is that there's a difference between decorative double quotes like these, which look different for the beginning quote and the end quote, and then there are programming double quotes which look like this. So I'm going to select this whole line, and I'm going to add a double quote, and notice how they look identical from the front and the back. So now it's going to print, sorry, there is not enough, and the enough of what? It's going to be the item that we're currently looping through. So let's change that to an F string, which makes that an active piece of code that's going to be inserted. And in this case, we're going to return false because there is not enough resources. But otherwise, if we manage to get to the end of the for loop and we still haven't returned or exited the function by returning false, then in this case, we can return true. So if this particular logic is a little bit confusing for you, you could have something like this. So you have is enough equal true, and you could change is enough to false if any of the order ingredients are greater than the resources. And finally, at the end, you could return is enough. So basically, it stays true unless one of these if statements gets activated. But for simplicity's sake, I'm actually just going to keep it simple like this. And we're now ready to receive that result here. So we can put an if statement here. If the resources are sufficient for the drink, then we can proceed to continue to the next step. The next step is to process coins. The user is going to be asked for the number of quarters they have, the number of dimes, nickels, and pennies, and you have to remember their values. So if you're from the US, this shouldn't be a problem. But if you're like me, somebody who's not from the US, I actually find it really confusing. When I go to the States, I always think that the larger coin, that the nickel, should be worth more than the dime, but I think that's just me being silly. So we're going to ask the user to insert some coins, we're going to process it, and then we're going to calculate the total value of the coins they inserted. That, to me, sounds like it should be a separate function as well. So let's create another function here, which I'm going to call process coins. And this is not going to take any inputs, but it is going to return the total value of the coins inserted. Now, how do we process coins? Well, first we can print to ask them to please insert coins. And then afterwards, we're going to somehow calculate a total, right? This is the variable that we're going to keep track of, and we're going to return as the output of this function. The total is going to be calculated based on the 4 types of coins. So the first question we're going to ask them is how many quarters? And this, of course, is going to be a whole number, so we're going to turn it from a string into an integer. And we know that each quarter is worth 0.25 of a dollar, so we can multiply the number of quarters by 0.25, and then we'll get the monetary value. Now, we'll need to do the same thing for a bunch of other coins. So instead of quarters, this is going to be dimes, and then it's going to be nickels, and finally it's going to be pennies. Dimes are worth 10 cents, nickels are worth 5 cents, and pennies are worth 1 cent. Now, instead of just setting the total to each of these values, every subsequent one other than the first one, which remember creates this variable and sets its value, every other one is just going to be added to the current value, like this. So now at the very end of all of this, we're going to return the total as the output. And whenever you have something that returns like both of these functions, you should probably be adding a docstring. So in this case, this returns the total calculated from coins inserted. And in this case, what happens is it returns true when order can be made, and false if ingredients are insufficient. Now let's call this function that we created process coins. If there's enough resources to make the drink, then the next step is to actually ask them for the money. So here is where we're going to call process coins. And notice when I write this and I hover over it, you can see that docstring we just wrote returns the total from coins inserted. That means this is going to return, and we need to capture the user's payment in this variable. So this returns, the output replaces this function call, and then it gets saved inside this variable called payment. Now, what are we going to do with this payment? Well, that goes on to the next step, which is to check that the transaction was successful. So we have to make sure that the user has inserted enough money to actually purchase the drink they wanted. But each drink, of course, has a different price. So if the user inserts enough money, then we're going to give them some change. But if they haven't inserted enough money, then we're going to say, sorry, that's not enough money, and the money is refunded. But if they have inserted enough money, then the cost of the drink is going to be added to the machine as the profit. So the next time when we trigger the report, then we're going to get to see the increase in the monetary value. Again, let's create a new function and let's get rid of some of these squiggly lines by adding enough spaces in between the functions. This one I'm going to call is transaction successful, because that's basically what we're going to be checking. And it's going to take two inputs. It's going to take an input in terms of the amount of money that was received, and it's also going to have another input, which is cost of the drink. This function's goal is to return true when the payment is accepted, or it's going to return false if the money is insufficient. Notice how there's this line to the right here of your editor. Basically what happens is if you have a line of code that's a little bit too long past the recommendation from PEP 8, you can see that PEP 8 recommends that a line should not be longer than 120 characters because it's very hard to read for somebody scrolling around like this. So in this case, they would want you to put it onto a new line so that you don't have to scroll and you can see it all on the same screen. But in our case, this is not a problem because we have not exceeded the line length recommendation. So how are we going to check if the transaction is successful? Well, if the money received is greater or equal to the cost of the drink, well, in this case, that means we should return true, right? The transaction is successful. And if it's not the case, if it's the opposite case, then we're going to print, sorry, that's not enough money, and the money is refunded to them. So let's print that here. And we're also going to return false. Remember that the return has to be the last thing in your function. If you put this above the print statement, then the print statement will never get called, and that's why you have this highlight. And if you click on it, you can see that it tells you this code is unreachable. So there's a lot of these little hints and tips that really help you when you're developing. But if the user has inserted enough money, then the cost of the drink should be added to the machine as the profit so that we can see it in the next time report is triggered. So this means that if this money received is greater or equal to the drink cost, then we're going to add to this variable called profit that we have up here, which starts out at 0, but we're going to add the drinks cost to profit. So we're going to say profit plus equals drinks cost. And now you'll see an error under the profit because this is acting inside a local scope and profit is outside in the global scope. So in order to reach it, we have to say global profit. And the final part of checking the transaction is seeing if the user has inserted too much money, then the machine is going to offer change. For example, here is however many dollars in change, and the change should be rounded to 2 decimal places. Again, it's going to be inside this if statement. So the change is going to be equal to the amount of money received subtracting the drink cost. And this, of course, could be any number of decimal places. So we can use the round function, which you've seen a long time ago, to round this number. And the second input is the number of decimal places. So if you just hover over the function name, then you can see the docs come up. And this function is basically going to round a number to a given precision in decimal digits. So the first is the number you want to round, and the second is the number of digits that you want after the dot, basically. Now that we've gotten hold of the change, we're going to print and tell the user, basically, here is this many dollars in change. And of course, I have to add an F to activate that F string. So now we're ready to call is transaction successful, and we're going to pass in the money received and the drink cost. So the money received is of course going to be the payment from the previous step that was calculated from all the coins, and the drink cost is going to be based on the drink and it's under the key cost, which we can confirm up here. So the drink is this dictionary, and then there's the ingredients and the cost. Let's rerun our code and let's test it out with something. Let's say I want a latte. Please insert coins. Let's say we tried to insert insufficient coins. It tells us, sorry, that's not enough money. Money is refunded, but let's try giving it enough coins this time. And in this case, it accepts it and it tells us here's $2.42 in change, rounded to 2 decimal places, and we're ready to take another drink. So now if we hit report, you can see that we've now earned some money in our machine and all our code is working as expected. So we're now ready to tackle the final part, which is to make coffee. If the transaction is successful and there are enough resources to make the drink the user selected, then the ingredients that make the drink should be deducted from the coffee machine's resources. For example, before I purchase a latte, I have 300 mils of water. After I purchase a latte, that gets reduced by 200 to 100. And the same happens to the other ingredient values, but of course the money goes up because I've already taken payment in the previous step. Let's take this into an if statement because remember, this function returns true when the payment's accepted or false if the money is insufficient. So this is where we're going to call our next function, which is to make coffee. So let's create make coffee. In order to make coffee, we need to know the drink name so that we can tell the user, here is your particular drink. And we'll also need to have the order ingredients. The goal of this function is to deduct the required ingredients from the resources. In order to do that, we're going to get hold of the order ingredients and we're going to loop through them. So for each of the item in the order ingredients, we're going to look inside the resources for that particular item and we're going to subtract the amount that's in the order ingredients. And once all of that is done, so the for loop ends, then we can print and we can even add an emoji to this. On a Mac, you can insert an emoji by going to Edit, Emoji and Symbols. On Windows, the easiest thing to do is to just search Google for a coffee emoji and then copy and paste it into your code. So now let's call make coffee here. And notice how if we are here, the machine is on and it's not any of these other previous choices. And then the resource is sufficient and the transaction is successful. These are all the steps that it took us to get to this particular stage in our code. So now we're going to make the coffee and we're going to pass in 2 things. So let's just see the prompt again. We need to give the drink name, which is going to be the choice that the user entered, and the order ingredients, which is going to come from the drink and it's under the key ingredients. So now we're ready to test and run our code once more. Let's say I want a latte and I'm going to insert lots of money. And now I have my latte. If I hit report, you should be able to see that a bunch of resources were subtracted and the money is increased. If I try to order another latte, it should fail because there's not enough water and there's not enough milk. You can see that it's not going to let me go through as long as one of the ingredients is not enough. So we've now managed to fulfill all of the requirements of our coffee machine program. Now there's probably a lot more complexity that you could add to your coffee machine, but basically what I wanted to show you today is how you would program something that exists in real life, like a coffee machine, and even something that seems as simple as a coffee machine. It can lead to a lot of errors, a lot of bugs, and a lot of anguish. But it's good. The more that you struggle, the closer you get towards your goals. And the clearer the role of the function, the easier it will be for you to untangle the logic. If you want to take a look at the completed code that I've written in this lesson, then simply head over to the link that's in the resources and you'll be able to see it in Replit. Make sure that you've managed to fix any issues in your code and that it runs exactly the same way as expected in the program requirements.